All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what is going on in Ukraine. And let's start things off with what is happening on the ground. Avdiivka, Bakhmut. The political article on the Ukraine counteroffensive. They also Politico also claimed that, according to their sources in the Pentagon, that there have been 100,000 Ukraine soldiers, the best, the most elite soldiers killed, not total casualties, killed. They also said that Ukraine is running very low on ammunition, weapons, artillery. And we have concrete dates, it seems, for a counteroffensive. I mean, it's happening in May. There's two scenarios: moving south or moving east and then south. I've never experienced this type of telegraphing of intentions from a military. I mean, it's pretty odd to see them talking about when this counteroffensive is going to happen and how it's going to happen. So let's start with all of this.
I'm going to say before we get on to the Politico article that I've read many articles over the course of this war that have made me angry. Perhaps this Politico article made me more angry than any other, but I'm going to get to that in time. Let's talk about the situation on the ground, because the situation on the ground for Ukraine is catastrophic. Now, there are three major positions where there's heavy fighting going on. One is Bakhmut, and last night there were reports that a place called Hormovil, a village near Bakhmut, has been captured by the Russians, by the Wagner forces. And if Hormovil has indeed been captured, and it's not yet confirmed, then one of the key roads is now definitely severed. Hormovil is right on top of one of those roads. Both of the two remaining roads, the Russians can shell anything that moves on it. But if Hormovil is captured, then the remaining corridor into Bakhmut that Ukraine is trying to use over the fields, the country roads, it's shrunk even further, and the chances of using one of the asphalt roads is completely gone. And there's lots of reports about fighting within Bakhmut itself, and all the indications are that the Russians are pressing forward in every part of Bakhmut now, and they're very close to the administration building and other things. And there was a deeply distressing article which came out yesterday in the Kiev Independent. Kiev Independent, English language, but published in Ukraine, obviously, by definition, pro-Ukrainian. And it described a catastrophic picture in Bakhmut. You had soldiers confirming that, they've been killed in huge numbers, that they've been killed almost as soon as they go to Bakhmut. It confirmed the reports that there have been mutinies amongst Ukrainian soldiers who were sent to Bakhmut. Many of them are now refusing to go because they see it as a death sentence if they're sent there. It talked about the Russians firing infinite amounts of artillery rounds. Infinite was the actual word used, at basically any Ukrainian position and any Ukrainian soldier that moves. The Russians, in fact, don't engage Ukrainian soldiers in firefights with small arms fire. They locate where they are, they find the position, they shell it, they destroy it. Ukrainian soldiers are killed. 90% of them are killed by artillery and airstrikes, not by small arms. So, it was a ghastly picture. And one Ukrainian soldier, he gave figures for the total number of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut and in the surrounding areas, and he said it's 28 to 30,000. Now, that's only a soldier, and he's only a staff sergeant, so perhaps he doesn't have a full picture. But I would say that's a more realistic number than, the 70,000 that Prigozhin was talking about and some of the huge numbers that other people have been talking about. And if it is that many, then I have to say the prospects of a Ukrainian counterattack in this area are looking to me, frankly, extremely dim. Anyway, so that was a terrible article in the Kiev Independent. Meanwhile, further north from Bakhmut, the Russians are advancing. They're advancing towards Slavyansk. They're well within shelling distance, apparently, now, of Slavyansk. They're pushing into Kupiansk itself. That's what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying. They've entered the industrial zone. And then yesterday, again, last night, unconfirmed reports, but probably true reports, but still unconfirmed, we must say that a very important village near Avdiivka, this is this fortified town near Donetsk city, the place where the Ukrainians shell Donetsk city from, that Krasnogorovka, this very important village, has now been captured by the Russians as well. And Denis Pushilin, who is the chief minister of the Donetsk Republic, he's now saying that the Russians are able to shell all the roads leading into Avdiivka. So an operational crisis in Bakhmut, horrible crisis, a similar, equally horrible crisis perhaps, starting to evolve in Avdiivka. All kinds of problems further north, perhaps, in Kupiansk. And yesterday, Reuters saying that the Ukrainians are clinging on in the north of Donbass, in the Kharkiv region, but that the Russians are pushing hard and that they're pushing towards Liman. Remember that town which the Russians captured in May and then the Ukrainians recaptured in the autumn? Anyway, the Russians are apparently closing in on Liman. So Liman, if they capture it, would bring them very close to Slavyansk, again from the north, and they're also advancing on Slavyansk from the south. And if they capture another village near Bakhmut called Orekhovo Ivanovo, then they're also able, they're within striking distance of Kramatorsk. And apparently it's open fields from this village, Orekhovo Ivanovo, to Kramatorsk. There's no obvious defense lines that the Ukrainians can set up there. So, you know, if you accept all these reports, and I see no reason why not to, then it's a disastrous picture. And notice the key report is the one that came out of the Kiev Independent. Its description of what's going on in the fighting in Bakhmut is just horrifying.
Yeah, before you get on to the Politico article, we've been saying on this channel since the very beginning that Donbass, the war in Donbass in the east of Ukraine, it ends with the fall of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk.
Yes.
But Slavyansk, for me, has always held that significance as once that falls, it's over for the fighting in the east. But do you have any idea how much of this fighting, how much of this advance from the Russian military is Wagner, and how much of it is the conscripted Russian military? Are they being used? Are these 300,000 forces that were conscripted, partially mobilized 4 months ago? Are they being put into battle or not?
No, as far as I can see, they're not. That's the other thing that must be extremely unnerving. I mean, some of those reservists that were called up were sent to reinforce existing Russian forces on the ground. So they were brought back up to strength, and they're no doubt continuing to receive reinforcements. But at least 160,000 men from those reservists have been held back and have not yet so far joined the fighting. And probably a lot more than that. And there's also a massive build-up, from what we can tell, of aircraft, tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, all those sort of things. So, so far, none of that has been activated. The main blow with the main force has not been launched yet. It's what you're seeing is a sort of very lightweight boxer up against a heavyweight. And that's what's happening. The heavyweight boxer is only, so far, is still punching rather softly. He's holding back his knockout blow, which one has to say must at some point come, because I can't imagine that the Russians, having mobilized this huge force, are simply going to leave it there doing nothing. So at some point, that surely is going to strike. So I think that's a very good point to say, because the Russians are not fighting at the moment with all their forces. Ukraine, to a great extent, is.
Well, no one brings up the fact that Russia is not fighting with all their forces. No one brings up the fact in the collective West media that Russia hasn't used any of these mobilized troops and reservists. They're just waiting in the wings there. No one ever mentions that. They focus on the convict prisoner Wagner forces. That's the way they paint the narrative. That's what they focus on.
Absolutely, you're completely right. I mean, and we have all the stories. Russia's running out of ammunition. Russia's running out of men. They're calling up women. Ukraine's already been doing that, but there's pictures of a Russian women's prison, and that's somehow proof that Russia's calling up women. There's been no evidence of any of this, not on any kind of scale. And of course, they're running out of missiles. They're running out of aircraft. As I said, no proof of any of this at all, but that's the narrative that's been spun. But the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, are telling a completely different story. And the facts on the ground point in a completely different direction. Let me repeat again, and going back to that Politico article, and that was an extremely interesting article, and slipping out that upward of 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, including most of the most experienced and trained ones. And that's not, us, it's not the Russians, it's not any of the, all of us speculate. That's Politico, and they're presumably getting their information. I mean, they are getting their information from people in the administration. You can see that. If you read the whole article, you can see that. So that's the reality. And that's consistent with what these soldiers in Bakhmut are telling the Kiev Independent. There's no reason to think that the soldiers in Avdiivka would be saying things any differently. And there was an article by the London Times about the situation near Kremenaya, and there was another one, this is in the area of Liman, Kupiansk, basically describing the same kind of situation, and a similar article also in Reuters. All of them pointing to a disastrous situation where they're out of men, out of ammunition, out of infantry vehicles, out of tanks, out of aircraft, out of pretty much everything. And they're still clinging on, trying to hold the line, and more of them are dying every day, all the time. And even as that's happening, and even as the Russians, as I said, keep their main forces back, Politico tells us that the administration is thinking about a counteroffensive. And notice, it's not the Ukrainians, it's the US, or let's not say the US, it's the administration that is trying to push this counteroffensive. And you have, we're told by Politico that the time window is small, Ukraine is running out of everything. So despite the fact that it's running out of everything, despite the fact that the US has less and less to give, despite the fact that most of the best soldiers Ukraine had have been killed, the US is rushing a couple of dozen tanks, but it's not its own tanks, notice, it's Germany's tanks. It's sending, a couple of score infantry fighting vehicles. Can't provide Ukraine with ammunition, though. Can't provide Ukraine with many of the things it needs. And it's rushing training. It's speeding up training. In other words, it's cutting corners with training. And it's going to send them into the path of this Russian juggernaut, even as we're also reading in other places about these enormous fortified lines that the Russians have built in southern and eastern Ukraine. I mean, I have to say, it really, really made me angry reading this. I mean, that knowing what they do, they're encouraging Ukraine to launch an offensive in these circumstances. I mean, to me, it's borderline criminal. Perhaps it is criminal. Perhaps there's an even stronger word, but I'm not going to use it in this program.
I can't figure out what's going on here because it doesn't feel right. None of this feels right. That's coming from the collective West or from the Zelensky regime. It's like you said. Politico is telling us 100,000 killed of the best soldiers. The best soldiers, 100,000 gone. No ammunition, no artillery, no weapons. We have the Kiev article. The Daily Mail ran a similar article from the Kiev article. They basically said the same thing. Things are catastrophic for the for the Ukraine military. But you have an article saying that we are, as Ukraine, as the collective West, we're going to mount a counter-offensive in May. They're giving us the month. May, in either one of two directions. They're giving us the month. They're telling us how they're going to do it.
Yeah.
We're going to either go through Kherson down south, or we're going to go east, and then we're going to go south and cut off the land bridge. And then we're going to go after Crimea. And I'm reading all of this, and I'm going, this doesn't make sense.
No, I know.
I mean, this makes zero sense. And I'm thinking, is this some sort of big, elaborate media bluff, or what's going on here?
Well, I mean, I don't understand it myself. I mean, maybe there's some kind of, logic, reason, methods to this madness that I can't see. Because to me, it does look like madness. I mean, what military command, and the United States is heavily involved in Ukrainian military decision making. What military command, in its senses, telegraphs weeks in advance where that is going to launch an offensive and where it's going to launch it, and tells the other side, well, actually, we're going to launch this offensive despite the fact that we've got no air force, no artillery, very few tanks, very few infantry fighting vehicles, and all our best men are dead. I mean, it's crazy. Now, the only explanation I can come up with is that this is more to do with US domestic politics now than it does with the situation in Ukraine. In other words, that Ukraine is being pushed into launching an offensive in these disastrous conditions, far worse than the ones in the autumn, which in the end didn't end well. I mean, I think that's a point to make. I mean, those offensives, it turned out that Ukraine lost thousands of men and most of its machines and ran through most of its artillery to achieve nothing of any strategic value. Well, we're going to do that in a far worse situation now. We're telling everybody we're going to do it. We're telling everybody where we're going to do it. You said two options, but they said, well, one is really very easy because you have to cross the river. So almost certainly it'd be the other one. So, the Russians obviously are listening and reviewing all of this, and they're drawing their own conclusions. I mean, as I said, it's crazy to do it like this. We don't know. I mean, here we are. We're guessing what the Russians might do, because the Russians don't tell us. And that's what a military staff ought to be doing. The Americans and the Ukrainians are telegraphing it across the entire world. I mean, the people in the Kremlin and in the Russian general staff must be scratching their heads and saying, what kind of people are we up against? But anyway, I can only assume, as I said, that it's connected with US domestic politics, that there's a desperate need either to turn the situation in Ukraine around in some way before the summer, because the summer is clearly now becoming the critical month, the critical period, beyond which, as I said, the whole situation becomes irretrievable. Or in the alternative, if this great offensive miscarries, to prepare the ground to blame someone else, blame Ukraine, blame Zelensky. So lots and lots of articles now, some in Politico as well, blaming Zelensky, saying that he's spent far too much time and energy concentrating on Bakhmut, that he's weakened the Ukrainian army ahead of this counteroffensive. So blame Zelensky, blame who knows whom else, DeSantis maybe, Trump, McCarthy, somebody else, blame someone else for this disaster. And in the meantime, don't worry, don't be too concerned if thousands more Ukrainians die. I have to say, as I said, I've been angry many times over the course of this war. But when I read that article by Politico yesterday, I've never been as angry as I have been reading an article like that. I mean, it's just profoundly shocked me in every way.
The one concern from people like Seymour Hersh is that NATO gets involved.
Yes.
And that's the only way that they can keep this thing going. Not that it would be successful. And Seymour Hersh is right. The only way they can keep this going is if NATO gets involved. And he expressed those concerns a couple of days ago. And I agree with him. It doesn't mean that NATO's going to get involved. It doesn't mean that if NATO got involved, it would change the trajectory of the war. It would be the only way that they can keep this war going a little bit longer. Do you think that may be what all of this telegraphing of what you're doing and all of these articles coming out, do you think that may be what we're heading towards?
It is not impossible at all. Now, I sometimes blame hot and cold about this. And, I read a couple of weeks ago an analysis that is circulating, but circulating privately, I should say, which discussed what NATO would need to do if it were to intervene in this war. And it compared the situation with the war in 1991 in Kuwait against Saddam Hussein's army. And it said, you'd need at least, that war against Saddam Hussein's army required 1 million men, and thousands of aircraft and thousands of tanks. You need at least 3 times that force to be able to prevail against the Russians. And you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it in that kind of time. But always, you have to say to yourself, that's a rational calculation. That's something that rational people would say. They'd say to themselves, well, look, there's no way we can prevail against the Russians. There's no way we can turn this round. Let's not even think about it. That's far too dangerous a thing to do. The problem is, with every single passing day, you get the sense that the people who are making the decisions are not rational. What sort of person, we come back to this original question that you asked me, what sort of person telegraphs 2 months in advance the fact that you're going to launch an offensive on a particular date and the location where that offensive is going to happen? Certainly not a rational military commander. So if we're dealing with irrational people, they might very well take that kind of irrational step. And if they're thinking in that irrational way, then maybe articles in Politico, like the ones that we've seen, make a kind of sense in that kind of context. That might be the method in the madness, if you like. I mean, I find that very disturbing and very scary. And it does make me wonder where this ends and how this ends and how you stop. Because to be very clear, you're not doubling down. You're tripling, you're quadrupling. You're betting the entire house, not just the house, everything you have on this one square. And when people start to do that, one fears that they're capable of anything.
Yeah, given all the financial crisis that's spreading throughout the collective West and possibly Europe, given everything that's happening, maybe war is what they've decided is the only way
Yeah.
they can distract and deal with what's going on.
Well, all
That
the
maybe
more
that's
so.
their answer.
All the more so, given that the financial crisis is partly a product of the very war that they've that they've initiated. I mean, not obviously the money they've given to Ukraine or the money they've given, the weapons they've given to Ukraine, but all the sanctions wars, the economic war that they've initiated, is one of the root causes of this financial crisis. But if you're thinking like that, then obviously, I mean, you can't pull back psychologically. It's impossible for you to do that. You have no reverse gear. I'll give you another example of how they have no reverse gear. Yesterday, there were two telephone conversations between Moscow and Washington. One was between Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Gerasimov, who's the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. We don't know very much about that one. The other was between Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and Lloyd Austin. And if you read the Russian readout of that conversation, which is quite detailed, Shoigu makes it absolutely clear that the reason that drone, that Reaper drone, was brought down, and I don't think there's any doubt now that the Russians brought it down. That's what we've been saying all along. Anyway, the reason Shoigu said was that you've been acting far too provocatively. You're going past the lines that we've set out. We are not going to tolerate this anymore. If you continue to do this, we will act proportionately, but we will act to stop this happening. So what does Lloyd Austin say in response? Well, we know because he's told us. He says the United States will continue to do exactly what it has done already. In other words, they will continue to send more drones closer, ever closer to Sevastopol and to Crimea, with the Russians obviously taking ever more measures to bring those drones down. So, as I said, these people have no reverse gear. And when you're in that kind of situation with people like that, then frankly, all bets are off. They can do anything.
All right, we will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, on Rockfin, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Telegram. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.